In 2016, Chris Paul, as part of his role with the NBA Players Union, negotiated for what is called the Designated Veteran Player Provision, but in the years since, it's become known as the Supermax. The Supermax is a provision in the NBA CBA that allows longtime veterans to sign massive deals late in their careers. Coincidentally, Chris Paul signed one of those deals and included a player option in his last year, which happens to be next season. Chris Paul can opt out this offseason and sign a new contract, and while I don't think he will, The Athletic has written about that possibility multiple times in the last few weeks, and even Bill Simmons has covered it on his podcast. Now we have to talk about it. My name is Mike, and I'm here with Sam, and for today's big question, we're talking about what happens if Chris Paul opts out. Welcome everyone to this week's edition of One Big Question. This is a weekly series here on our YouTube channel that we post every Wednesday. If you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like us to cover, just suggest them in the comments. We'll try to get to those in the future. So for now, Sam, we have to talk about what happens if Chris Paul opts out. I want to start this by saying that this is very unlikely. No player has ever turned down the amount of money that Chris Paul would have to turn down in order for him to be a free agent in this coming offseason. He has 1 year, $44 million left. So it'd be insane for him to do it. And at his age, it would be kind of insane to turn down that level of money as well, just in case he gets injured or something like that. You want to have that extra money. There are ways for him to turn it down and still make a ton of money, and we're going to talk about those in a second. But it just would be unprecedented. But I want to say this before we get into it. It's not unprecedented for a player to turn down a large amount of money in order to sign a deal somewhere that they want to be for a longer period of time. In fact, Gordon Hayward, just this last offseason, turned down his player option for $34 million in Boston to sign in Charlotte for a longer-term deal. So a player doing something like this is very possible. In fact, Gordon Hayward's deal that he signed in Charlotte is actually for less money per year than the 1 year that he would have had left in Boston. So obviously he had motivations to do that, probably some sort of fear of hurting himself in that last year, wanted to sign a longer-term deal in Charlotte. So I still think it's very unlikely that this would happen, but I guess we have seen a player do this in the recent past. Do you think that it's something that could happen, or do you see it as much of a long shot as I do?
I definitely think Chris Paul is going to talk with his agent, and ultimately they're going to decide to do the best financial thing for him. And if you're thinking about this from a long-term state of mind, Chris Paul has had such a terrific season this year that I think he could easily go to someone else and demand a 3-year deal. I don't think anyone's going to give him 4, but a 3-year deal worth less per year than the $44 million he would be turning down, but it would make a lot of sense for him long term. One example that I want to bring up, Bill Simmons talked about this on his podcast this week, and now usually I don't really take what Bill Simmons says very seriously anymore, but I thought this was a good point, so I wanted to bring it up. If you look at a team like the Knicks, who the Suns just beat, the Knicks have had a wonderful year. What they are really missing is that sort of offensive presence at the point guard position who can kind of raise all boats, a guy who can take their offense up 3 or 4 notches. That is describing a guy like Chris Paul. Chris Paul, theoretically, on the Knicks, and I'm just using them as one example, but he could do for them next season basically the same thing that he did for the Suns this year, where he took them, or helped to take them, from a 9th or 10th seed to second in the Western Conference. And so now maybe Chris Paul wants to go to New York, maybe he doesn't want to go to New York. But the point is, if there are teams like that out there, if there are potential suitors, Chris Paul and his agent, they can go to James Jones, they can go to the front office and say, hey, here's this team that's willing to offer me 3 years, $30 million per year. I'm prepared to go there. You can either match or I'm walking. And I don't think that seems like such an unrealistic possibility. You might think it's crazy that he would turn down the $44 million a year. But for the long-term flexibility, it's not necessarily, I want to stress that Chris Paul hates it in Phoenix, that it's such a bad situation for him and he's trying to get out. That's not what this is about at all. But it's about maybe the Suns are going to be in a situation where they have to think about coughing up the money to keep him for 3 years into his age 38 season.
Yeah, there's really 2 scenarios where Chris Paul opts out for this. It's a pretty obvious situation for the Suns. Either The Suns now have to compete with other teams to keep him, or he's opting out specifically because he wants to leave. And those are the two possibilities that, as Suns fans, that we have to really contend with. And I think you're right. It could be his last chance to sign a multi-year deal. Because what if he opts into this year and hurts himself somehow this season, and then no team wants to sign him? I think that's relatively unlikely for how he's been playing. He just seems like a guy who takes really good care of his body. But it could be his last chance to sign a longer-term deal. And you mentioned a deal maybe at less money. I think of the Kyle Lowry deal he signed recently that was like 3 years, $90 million. Basically, $90 million over the course of 3 years would double what he's getting in this single year, but ensure that he's getting at least $30 million for the 2 years after this. So twice as much money and for a longer period of time where he has some sense of security. Now, first, we should talk about if he opts out, but he does want to stay. You mentioned New York. That becomes immediately leverage for him and his agent as far as what the Suns could now sign him for. Now, the Suns could open up the cap space to sign him, being that his massive contract now comes off the books, and that allows them to have money to sign him. He's also on the team long enough that they are allowed to sign him above the cap, depending on the amount of money that goes above the cap. It seems like a pretty much a guaranteed thing that the Suns would want to sign him, regardless of the leverage he has here. James Jones was actually asked early on in the season, what's the plan after Chris Paul? Like, what's the backup plan? And he responded to that with, why couldn't it be Chris Paul? Why is the backup plan someone else? Chris Paul takes care of his body. He knows who he is, and he clearly, James Jones thinks of him as a piece that could stay longer. I think that the Suns probably would immediately try to come to some sort of deal with him that would sign him until maybe he's 38 years old, which could be a little scary, I think, to some Suns fans. Do you agree with that? Do you think that the Suns would cave pretty easily here?
I think there's only a handful of players in every generation who are capable of their bodies not falling apart by the time they're 38, 39 years old, who can still contribute to winning basketball. Based on what I've seen out of Chris Paul, I would bet that he's one of those guys. And so for that reason, I'm already interested in re-signing him. But also we need to quickly talk about if you had to replace him for whatever reason. I just don't think the options to replace him are there.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I'm personally willing to pay Chris Paul basically whatever he wants. If he wants a long-term deal, let's get it done.
Yeah, and there are reasons to be scared of that. But say he does want to leave. Say the Suns do not have an opportunity, or maybe they're weighing their options outside of Chris Paul at that point. Obviously, an early discussion and something that we think is not even going to be something that Suns fans have to worry about. But say he does. I mean, we can quickly cover this before we talk about what they could do with the cap space that's left over. This would leave a massive hole in the Suns. It's not just the fact that, one, they took so long to find a point guard. They finally got Ricky Rubio, obviously upgraded again with Chris Paul. It's a leadership void. It's a shot creation void Chris Paul can create for himself. Obviously passing. And then that point guard position is really vital. It's really important. And I've talked about it before. I believe that superstars raise the ceiling of everyone around them in general just because the entire team now carries the weight of that legacy. So obviously this would leave a massive, massive hole in the Suns, right?
Absolutely. And do you want to get into the names? Because it's just the fact that the guys who are available on the free agent market, just because Chris Paul is making $44 million doesn't mean the Suns wouldn't have $44 million in cap space. They could have about $25 to $30 million max of cap space if Chris Paul leaves. And that's assuming that, I don't want to get too deep into salary cap stuff, but that's assuming you waive these things called cap holds and maybe forego some of your depth. So I just think the options to replace him aren't there.
Yeah, and there's some obvious names out there. I wrote down a few. I'm sure you have a few as well if the Suns had to look at the free agent market. And this is the reason I think Chris Paul has a lot of leverage if he does end up opting out. There's Mike Conley. He could be a free agent. Kyle Lowry, actually kind of an interesting one because he can replace a lot of the things that Chris Paul does. As far as how good it is, it can be debated. It probably depends on if you're an East Coast team or a West Coast team, how good you think those two guys are compared to each other. Goran Dragic has a team option with Miami. If he, for some reason, the Miami Heat were to decline that option, he could be a free agent. I also wrote down Spencer Dinwiddie, Dennis Schroeder, just other guys that are longtime veterans that could be available. What did you look at when you thought about what could be in this case?
I looked at all of those. I also looked at some shooting guards. I think DeMar DeRozan is a really interesting name, a guy who's averaged a career high in assists this year. If you were willing to toy with the idea of moving Devin Booker to the point guard spot. But beyond that, there's at the shooting guard position, you're talking about, I mean, you could go and call up like Evan Fournier. You know, it's just, it's not the same caliber of player. And in addition to doing this, making this sort of move would make it harder to retain the pieces you currently have. Like if you wanted to re-sign Cameron Payne to a long-term deal, if you wanted to re-sign Torrey Craig, all of that would be more difficult. So bottom line for me is I'm willing to pay Chris Paul what he wants.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to do it. I also wrote down a name like TJ McConnell, and that's where you start getting into the real depths of this and thinking, well, it's not just a point guard problem, it's a star problem. The Suns need another star next to Devin Booker, and that's going to be Chris Paul. He'll have all the leverage. I don't think this is going to be a massive storyline. Obviously, it was something that we were sort of forced to talk about thanks to a lot of media listing him as one of the potential free agents in this coming offseason. But if you'd like to hear more about it, listen to our podcast, The Timeline, a Phoenix Suns podcast. Subscribe to this channel. We'll be back next week with another one of these videos. Thanks for watching.